Hi, HR Nation. It's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Chris Rosett. Chris is the Director of HR Analytics at Comcast. Chris, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So excited to be here.
Thanks for tuning in very early in the morning from the US to join us. Chris, fill in the gaps. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey to where we are today.
Yeah, so my journey to HR, I think like a lot of people in HR these days, isn't super straightforward. But once I got into HR, how I ended up in HR analytics is, I think, a little bit more traditional. So I kind of ended up in HR about halfway through university when I realized I didn't really want to go to medical school, which is what I was sort of on the road to do. Because I really didn't like the hoops that I was jumping through and the types of classes. It really wasn't for me. So I asked a mentor what I wanted to do, and he kind of encouraged me to think about what it was that was attracting me to the medical school. And I realized that I really like working with people, and I really liked fixing things, right? So I really wanted to be in service to people in an effort to make things better. And once I kind of figured that out, two things happened at once. One is I had to take a psychology class, and I totally fell in love with it as an undergrad. And at the same time, I was sort of gravitating towards being an entrepreneur. I kind of started a business with some friends at school. And those two things work together. And how do you go and make psychology and business into helping people to make things better? And that's when I learned about organizational psychology. So when you go into organizational psychology, which was sort of the natural next step, I started to learn about all of the ways that HR practitioners, right, can partner with businesses to make things better. And about 4 years or so into my HR career, where I've been doing org development and learning and development and selection strategy, HR analytics started to get really hot. And when that happened, people started looking around their organizations and saying, you know, who in HR knows how to do math, right? And those of us that raised our hand, which were largely, you know, the IO psychologists in the world, got pulled in to start leaning into that slightly more technical world of HR analytics. So by the time this all happened, I was working at Verizon. And so I started working with data cleanliness and connecting data and basic reporting, and then was ultimately able to move into more advanced stuff like quality of hire, cost of turnover, and then eventually some nifty predictive stuff. So those deliverables together were kind of a good resume in a world where HR analytics is picking up steam. And eventually I got a call from Comcast to say, hey, do you want to come and start our HR analytics program for technology and product? So went from being kind of not knowing where I was going, but really not liking medical school, to realizing, man, these things that I really like in psychology and business can really be applied to be in service to people. And that's how I kind of ended up in HR. And then that evolved because I had a proclivity for math, right, in the world of HR analytics.
Fantastic. Well, very interesting journey. And like many of your peers, it's always unconventional.
Yeah.
Certainly never seems to be the plan of anyone. And I suppose it's such a new space as well, that back then it wasn't even a career option, right? It wasn't.
HR analytics, you mean specifically?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, HR analytics. So
yeah, when you know, people often say HR analytics is like this new thing. Organizational psychologists have been trying to do HR analytics for decades, right? Since the 70s when it first became a thing. But HR technology within organizations hasn't been such that the data has been available in a way that you could really do good studies. A lot of the organizational psychology literature is built on experimental and quasi-experimental lab experiments, right? But now HR data is getting so sophisticated that we can actually start to do things that in the 70s and 80s and 90s just weren't technically possible.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of HR analytics now, what does it mean to you, and why is it so important for businesses?
When I think of HR analytics now, for me, it's about driving a data-based decision culture, right? HR analytics to me is, to the extent that it's feasible, removing the concept of experience trumps all. What happened yesterday is what's going to work tomorrow, and conventional wisdom is what drives the way that we do processes. We have these data at our fingertips now in a way that we can make empirically backed decisions. And anytime a leader has a question, whether it's a business leader or an HR leader that concerns talent, we should be able to, at least in some way, back it up with theory or data that we have. So for me, it's really about saying, okay, business leader in situation whatever, I understand you want to go that direction. What information do we have in the science, right, that can help us make a better decision?
Fantastic. And so and what area, because it's such a broad area now, it seems to be expanding the different areas that you, not just, as you said, not just HR, outside of HR and helping the rest of the business. What areas of HR analytics most excites you, that you're most interested and engaged in?
I am, so my sort of selfishly, my background is person environment fit, right? So how do you take particular individuals with particular characteristics and put them in environments that have other characteristics, right? So you think about working for, a government agency versus working for a tech startup, right? Very different cultures, and people's personalities can fit in those places very, very differently. So that idea, when you do that well, you get happy people and you get successful businesses. So for me, to the extent that HR analytics can help build that equation is super exciting to me. And that can apply in different parts of the analytics lifecycle, right? So from a selection perspective, when we select well, person environment fit gets better, right? In talent development, when we develop you more effectively, you live and breathe in an environment and you flourish there and you're happier and the business is better, right? So for me, all across the life cycle, thinking, man, how do we make these teams get to their goals more effectively and successfully develop people while they're doing it? Because both sides win when you do that.
Mm-hmm. Is this something you've been able to embed in the businesses you've been in, this process? Or is this something that's brought more on your brain that you're looking to do now?
Yeah, so I when I was in selection, for example, one of the things that we often get to do is something called job evaluation, where you go and you look at a job and you determine the types of the way that the tasks get done, and you evaluate how we select for that job, right? So if you think about a call center, for example, 20 years ago, we might have had to select for certain competencies, certain skills, right, because of the type of work that they've done. 20 years later, the technology is different, the rate is different. We have, chat right now. Chat is a new thing. Bilingual is very big. So now all of a sudden, the skills that it takes to do that job are very, very different. So people that might have been traditionally successful with one set of skills in the job no longer are. So when you have the opportunity to do that type of work and do the validation studies and the empirical analysis to say, here's what we need to do. And by the way, when I give this person this test before we hire them, I can show you that they're going to be more successful in the job, right? That's kind of one example of a place where using data can help you improve the employer relationship.
Fantastic. And one of the big questions I get, and you probably can help here because you've been doing it for some time now, is where do companies start on their analytics journey? For you, if you were to give advice to other leaders that are starting their HR analytics journey within your organization, based on your experience, what advice would you give them? Where should they focus their attention in the first, say, 30 days or 30 to 90 days in the organization?
So two things. The first is data cleanliness. That is, I think, one of the biggest inhibitors to organizations getting out of their own way when it comes to doing HR analytics well. Within HR, within HR data, there's always multiple versions of the truth, right? Because you can organize data the way that finance looks at it, or the way that the business leaders look at it, or the way that HR looks at it. And if you run 3 different headcount reports with 3 different sets of filters, you might get 3 different answers, which doesn't mean any of those are wrong, right? Because a cost center is just as important as an organizational hierarchy. They're just used for different purposes. But often those terms, sometimes called data governance, are not super well defined. So a first place to start is, what is our version of truth? Where does our data come from? How is it refreshed? Who owns it? So that we can get it in a reliable way, right? Because before you can have valid insights, you need to have reliable data, right? And sometimes reliability and validity are used as the same term. Reliable means repeatable. Valid means correct, right? It's got to be reliable or it can be valid, right? So that's the first place to start. The second is, you don't have to start big. Oftentimes we're sort of waiting for this quantitative savior to come and deliver us from our HR data issues. but fancy math is not always required, and certainly not the most low-hanging fruit in an organization. Being able to get your hands around reliable data empowers people to go off and do cool stuff with simple math, right? Averages and medians and bell curves and subgroup differences. We don't have to jump right to machine learning. You can say, hey, there's this group and this group. Do we pay them differently? There's this group versus this group. Do they perform differently? And whatever the hot topic is in your business, and your HR people know the storylines, you're simply empowering them to back that up with information.
Yeah. Interesting. And when you did this in your own organization, when you joined the business you're in now, what was the biggest challenge that you found when doing that?
Comcast is an enormous company, right? So 160,000 employees across, I couldn't even tell you how many sites. Right?
I can imagine. I can imagine.
Yeah, when you talk about all of the warehouses and the call centers and the corporate buildings, right, and the regional offices and, hundreds of sites. Aligning the data is an ideal, right? Aligning the agendas is the reality of the situation, right? Because different parts of the business are trying to do different things, and therefore they have different needs. So, for example, right, the way that we look at turnover for a call center, right, for that type of talent and that quantity of talent with that quantity of turnover is very different than how we look at a technical population of electrical engineers working on improving our network reliability. Their turnover is different. We pay them differently. There's far fewer of them. So when somebody says fixed turnover, well, who are we being asked to fix turnover for, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing to do is get in and learn where the different types of data live, who owns those data, and what business leaders need what type of information to help make higher quality decisions. Because that's the goal at the end of the day, right? Driving competitive advantage to do better business decisions about people, right? Mm-hmm. Period, full stop.
Yeah.
And we're equipping business leaders with the ability to do that. But what data they need and what stories they're telling are different depending on what populations they're serving and what challenges they're having.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And it's certainly something that comes up at a lot of our meetings now. I think the number one thing, everyone says, stop talking about HR analytics until you have the data in place. Yeah. You don't need to hire in all of this talent and all of these new roles that you have in mind if you haven't even got your data in place. And also the next step shouldn't be doing that. It should be then translating that data into a language that the business can understand before you start going in and hiring more talent into the organization around that area.
Yeah, and it's not a binary spectrum either, which sometimes I think it's mistakenly attributed to. We're saying either our data is messy or our data is clean. There is no perfectly clean data set out there, right? It's contextual to the business leader, the business problem you're trying to solve, and the population you're trying to serve. So it's not about going from messy to clean. It's about going from messy to valid, which is not necessarily exactly the same thing.
Yeah, interesting. So for the next step, what skills do companies need then to successfully do HR analytics within their businesses?
So for me, it's largely about, I'll talk about four things that I think are kind of important. The first is storytelling, which I think is sort of the generic sort of one that's on the tip of everybody's lips today, right? We need to be good storytellers. But I don't want to underestimate it because it's really, really important. That said, I don't think necessarily the way you tell the story has to be the same way every time, right? If you're trying to build a business case and convince a leader to do something a certain way, that's one type of story. If you're giving an update that's evaluating in some sort of intervention that you've designed, that's a very different type of story. So storytelling is sort of intricate in that you need to design your story based on the type of data that you're trying to communicate. So that's one skill. Second skill is data interpretation and manipulation. That's something that isn't widely available in the HR ranks currently. You have a lot of folks that are maybe converted data scientists and don't necessarily know the HR business that well. And on the flip side, you have HR people who are interested in data, but may not necessarily understand the bases of basic statistics and how they apply to business needs. So taking those quant people and teaching them HR and taking those HR people and teaching them data, right, are two ways to get at the same issue to build those skills. Third is tech ramp up and adaptability. This is sort of a kind of a no-brainer, and I think it's across industries, but I don't want to underestimate it, especially in a fundamentally non-technical function like HR, is the ability to ramp up to new technology and learn how to use new technology is important because it's constantly changing, right? 20 years ago, we were all on AOL Instant Messenger, right? Right? And now we're all expected to figure out how to use Slack, right? Which is the tool of the day that does all kinds of new, interesting things.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you don't have that skill set to adapt your technological savvy, you're going to get left behind pretty quickly in HR analytics. And then the last one is legal and ethical competence, right? That's one that sometimes gets overlooked, especially in the US. I know in Europe, the data compliance laws are a lot more stringent. But when we're talking about having our data, it's not just can we, but it's also should we. When we're talking about getting our hands on data, decisions we're making with our data, what sorts of algorithms we're building. There's stories, if you look to the popular news about, machine learning creating bias in some cases, or, creating systematic, adverse impact. Unintentionally, obviously, no data scientist goes in intending to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But keeping a pulse on, we're ultimately trying to serve people, right? And there's a lot of important rules out there about people so that we're treating them fairly. And if we forget that and we just look at predictive validity, we're losing the human element of human resources analytics.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, or they're all great points you make, by the way. I think the last point was very important. It's something that isn't spoken about much. Only recently, a few people I've spoken to said, how do you find that balance between extracting, going into all these sets of data, but also thinking about the human element too. A lot of people get caught up in the moment, or they're not really thinking in that way. But I also think that's why it's powerful. I think HR will do a lot better because they're naturally people anyway. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen.
And if I can make one more comment on that, I think sort of the reason that's happening is that historically predictive analytics has been driven at consumer behavior. So I'm going to go build an algorithm. I'm going to go look at this information. I'm going to go create this software program, and I'm going to use it to drive buying behavior, right? And you as the consumer, you ultimately get to choose, do I buy or do I not buy? So predictive validity is pretty much the golden standard, because if it works, the product works. If it doesn't work, then we don't get the revenue and we go back to the drawing board. When you move that sort of science into the world of employee decisions and talent decisions, the rules of engagement are very, very different, because now we're talking about who do we promote, who do we not promote, who do we select for this program or that program, who do we invest in versus who do we not invest in, maybe geographically or maybe job function wise. Those rules are different. And so the math has to be different so that it supports the important tenets of taking care of employees.
Fantastic. Well, that leads us quite nicely on to the next question. What would be interesting to know based on your career? Could you share perhaps a project that you've been through or a transformation that you've led that most stands out to you that you're proud of?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'll pick one that we did this year that I'm really excited about, that we were able to bring to our leaders. So everyone's familiar with the hype over the last 10 years about millennials, right?
Yeah, who hasn't?
Exactly, right? And most of the conversations have really been focused on their behaviors and their dispositions.
Yeah.
And specifically how they're fundamentally different than previous generations. Now, most of these differences, frankly, are kind of overblown when you examine the effect sizes and the actual science. But there are some really key differences that have impact. One of which I think that is often overlooked is just straight up size, how big this population is. Because millennials are the biggest group of humans born in a 10 to 15 year period, pretty much ever.
Oh, really?
And, coming in second are the boomers, and then sort of stuck in between them is this Gen X thing. And this kind of creates an interesting puzzle when you think about headcount in the job market, because from the 70s to like the 2010s, the workforce was really defined by the boomer. So we talk about this from an economic perspective, but not often from the organizational design perspective, because as the boomers entered the workforce, they forced orgs to become really young. And then over the last 40 years, right, as they move up the ladder, the design of organizations have kind of naturally evolved to suit this really big group as they move through their careers. Now, fast forward to today, and we have all these boomers in their late careers, And we have organizations that have evolved to kind of look like an upside down triangle, if that makes sense, right? With the wide part on the top. Not all the way to the top, obviously, right? The executives and the senior executives are still very exclusive. But if you look at like where heads are allocated across an organization, you're hearing these days people talk about being top heavy. Now that passive evolution has really created competitive disadvantage, because if you have too many roles at the top of your org to sustain the retiring boomers and the smaller group of Gen Xers, and then too few roles lower in the organization where there's a boon of talent, you're sort of leaving talent on the table in one place and you don't have enough bench in the other place. So visually, right, it's kind of like trying to stick an hourglass shaped box through a triangle shaped hole.
Yeah, I can see it.
Right. So I guess what does that have to do with a project, right? So we studied this at Comcast this year, particularly for an impactful job function that we think is really important for the future. And when we took our data and examined the shape of our org and where we have heads allocated and what we pay them, and what the current and future job market looks like, we saw that we really have an amazing opportunity to move money and heads lower down into the organization, to make our shape more appropriately match this emerging workforce. So, and not only that, right, but we get more heads for less money, and we're ultimately improving our long-term bench strength. So I'm kind of proud of this study because of a previous point that I mentioned, in that it didn't really require fancy mathematics, right? Right, because that's one of the most common misconceptions, is that, you know, they're looking for this savior to turn scary data into insights. But the real competitive differentiator here is the ability to think critically about the data and how it applies to a given scenario or a business need, right? Mm-hmm. So by looking at the theory and the evolution and just the straight numbers of what types of people are at what stages in their careers and need to be at what levels in the organization, we were able to say, man, here's a macro trend. Let's get introspective about it and create competitive advantage over the next several years by shifting the way that we're hiring and shifting the jobs we're paying for and shifting who we're looking at in the job market.
Amazing. That's something that I haven't come across before. So thank you very much for sharing that. That's very, very interesting work that you guys are doing there. And as you said, it doesn't have to be so complicated. Like you said, a lot of people seem to be overcomplicating some of these processes and the data. And you've obviously found a very clear need, and that your business can benefit from as well, and give you that competitive advantage. What are some of the practical steps that you took to start that process?
Clean data and taking your time to dive into the clean data, right? So we already talked about the clean data. I won't belabor that.
I mean, within the business, to make those changes within your organization.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So what were the steps? You know, now you just give us an amazing outline of what mm-hmm. the insights that you found, and you've seen that there's a clear competitive advantage here that we can leverage. What were the next steps? What practical steps did you take to then embed that into the business?
Cross-functional partnership, mostly, right? So when you think about shifting the shape of an organization, it's sort of a combination. Think about what I call the headcount ecosystem, right? As kind of like a bayou. You know what a bayou is?
No, sorry.
that might be a U.S. phenomenon. So a bayou is kind of like a river. We have them in the South, and what happens in a bayou is it's like a river, and there's water running through the middle of it like a river. But It's running so slowly that the water that's closer to the shores is stagnant. So it's kind of like a lake and a river in one waterway.
Wow. Okay.
And if you think about headcount like that, you have people that are coming in and going out, either because they come and they turn over. You have people coming in and getting promoted. But then you also have the cultural glue headcounts, right, that are staying in their jobs for longer, people that are further in their career, they might have less potential. So you have this sort of interesting flow into and out of any given population you want to talk about. And when you think about the headcount equation like that, you've got TA, who's bringing water into the river, talent acquisition. You've got talent management, who's facilitating stirring the water, right, while it's in there. And then you've got the business, who actually cares what those people are doing. And so you have to partner across those three groups to say, hey, we found this interesting thing. We think we need to get from where we are right now to where we want to be in 5 years. And how are we going to do that? So it's three different sets of strategies based on what we need, because the business knows, well, we need more of this job code and less of this job code because this skill is more important than that. We need TA to be able to say, well, we need to pay this much for this type of job, and it takes a long time to find this type of job, but less time to find this type of job. And then talent management to say, what are the financial implications and the headcount allocations we have to be able to move these people around once they're in. So we're at the early stages of that now because we were able to take that data and present it to the senior leadership in tech and product. Talent acquisition already sort of fundamentally new. Sorry, my lights went off.
That's all right. Happens to me too. You got to wave around, the lights come back on.
Yeah. So the groups need to sort of partner. So TA already sort of implicitly knew that this was coming because they've seen the trends over the last several years. But TM and the business were really, I think, brought on board to say, oh, wow, this really makes sense now. So now we're at the stage where we're starting to partner and say, well, we're at X% in this job, at this age, at this generation. This is going to look like, the job market's going to look like this in 5 years. So how do we go in and create some structures to match that in the future? So we're sort of early on. I can't really give you like the...
No, sure. But it's very interesting.
It's about the cross-functional partnership of those three groups.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. As I said before, and I've had many of these conversations and not something I've come across. I think you've identified something very interesting there that could really help your organization. And as you said before, give them that competitive advantage. So I'll be very interested to hear how that progresses in the coming years. Very interesting. And I know you're one of your passions around machine learning, something you're interested around, and you speak a lot on the area. Could you share some of the insights and your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so machine learning is a really interesting...
It's thrown around a lot, by the way, in our community, but no one really seems to know what it means.
Yes. And
the kindest way I can say it.
Yeah. And who you ask about what machine learning is, you're going to get a different answer.
Exactly. I've realized that.
Yeah. There are folks out there that are, creating the first self-driving cars, right? And are programming Watson. And, what they would consider machine learning is very different than where I think we're at in HR currently. In HR, I like to call it baby machine learning, because to me, machine learning is anytime you're asking a computer to come up with an answer that you didn't program yourself, right? Because up until this machine learning thing happened, a computer was just a processor. All computers do is do stuff faster. They don't actually come up with any answers. You say, I want you to take the blue thing and the red thing. I want you to mush it together and give me what comes out. You stick in the blue and the red, you get purple, right? You stick in the red and the yellow and you get orange out the other side. But you've already told the computer what to do. It's just following the instructions, right? It's kind of like following a recipe.
Yep.
In a kitchen. What machine learning is instead of saying, I'm going to program you exactly to follow these instructions, I'm going to give you a set of guidelines, and I'm going to allow you to observe multiple cases, and then you are going to pick out the patterns and tell me the relevant commonalities to provide some sort of insight, right? So I'll paint it in an analogy, right? I could give you a recipe for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? That's procedural. There's ingredients and there's steps. You go and you get the bread, you go and get the peanut butter, you go and get the jelly, you bring it together, you put it on the counter, you open up the bread, you take out a piece of bread, you open up both jars, you get yourself a butter knife, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You can follow that general.
Yeah.
The problem with that approach is that if you coat it to get grape jelly and then they go to the refrigerator and there's only strawberry jelly in there, the software doesn't work, it crashes.
Mm-hmm.
What machine learning does is it says, okay, instead of giving you this list of steps and ingredients, I'm just going to show you 500,000 instances of people making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And then you're going to pick out the important bits. So then it can figure out, oh, it's not the fact that it's grape jelly that's important. It's the fact that it's jelly that's important, right? And so those kind of human elements that cause computers to fall apart because they're so literal sort of go away.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So how we're applying that in HR these days is we're starting to look at some of the very basic and early stages of doing things like logistic regressions or exponential smoothing, which are simple things where we're saying, hey, here's a bunch of characteristics that correlate with an outcome. Tell me which ones are most important. That's kind of a logistic regression. Or, hey, here's how a particular variable ebbed and flowed over time. Look at other times that are close to it and look at similar months from previous years and create some coefficients to kind of predict what next month or next quarter is going to be like. So when you compare that to IBM Watson, right, it's not really nearly at the same level, but it is a way where we can say, hey, math, can you help us think about how these things correlate so I can predict turnover, or so that I can select the most important characteristics in a competency model. And so that's some of the ways that machine learning is starting to help with things like recruiting. It's starting to help things with like, forecasting headcounts, and it's starting to make its way into the real world of practical HR.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone out there now, or including yourself, that's actually using this on a day-to-day basis and embedded in the business?
Yeah.
Do you know of any examples that you've seen the successes that companies, HR specifically, have had with machine learning?
Yeah, so I haven't done it at Comcast yet because we're still, I think, in a growth and a building phase. When I was at Verizon, one of the things that we did after we had clean data and we were running our descriptive quality of hire analytics on a regular basis, is we took those data and we said, let's get all of the data we can possibly get our hands on for frontline retail and frontline customer service, and let's see what we see with regard to what drives turnover, what drives performance, what drives promotions. And we were able to do a couple of different predictive analytics that helped some things. So one thing we did was, which I haven't mentioned, is a cluster analysis, which is when you look at particular groups that share characteristics and you look at some kind of outcome. So I'm going to look at green people and blue people and yellow people, and then I'm going to look at how they perform. And it's like, oh, well, green people perform better and blue people perform worse and yellow people are somewhere in the middle. So if you're green, I can then predict that you're going to perform some amount better.
Sure.
Right? And so we were able to do that to differentiate out some of our new hire populations to see when are people at risk for termination, when are people likely to get promoted, when are people likely to perform better. And then from there, we were able to predict if we hire X number of people, we're going to see X amount of performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So where that comes into application in HR is for our cost of hire and cost of turnover analytics. When we go and we say, okay, we're hiring, here's an example. We're launching the iPhone next September. We could hire a whole bunch of people in August, right? And then they'll be here for September and they can serve our customers. Conversely, we will hire a whole bunch of people in March, and we know some of them are going to quit. But then when we get to September, we will have a more tenured workforce that will be better able to serve. Because when you're on the job for 6 months, you're way better than when you're on the job for 1 month. Now, the question is carrying all of those salaries
worth? Yeah.
Right. Because you got to carry a lot of people. You got to deal with more hiring. Because if you hire 100 people in August, you'll have to hire 150 people in April, right, to get the same amount of heads in September.
Mm-hmm.
And because we were able to do this predictive analytics and understand the differential the differential performance we would see and the amount of turnover we could predict and expect based on when we were hiring people, we could put numbers around that. And we could say, we will receive better performance, this amount of dollars. We will see this amount of turnover, this many heads. And then it's just arithmetic. Is this approach more or less smart than this other approach, to be able to see what's better for the customer and what's better for the business.
Mm-hmm. What's the outcome that you had in that specific scenario?
Well, since I'm not with Verizon anymore, I don't really want to share the specific outcomes of that. Well,
look, we know that some of the biggest costs to companies are hiring and people leaving. So
right, exactly.
Any
Especially
data
on the front line.
Exactly.
What I will say on the comment, without revealing specific data, is that customer service matters a lot. It matters a lot to companies like Verizon. It matters a lot to companies like Comcast, and they're investing greatly in building their brands with regard to taking care of their customers and with regard to taking care of their employees. And that's where these studies come from, right? They say, hey, the least customer savvy way to do it would be say just hire people the day before we hire them, but the day before we need them, and then let them quit after we're done, right? And that's not best for the customer. It's not best for the employee. But the question came because we care about those things these days, and we're saying, hey, this study might show us that not only is it better for the customer, but it's also better for the consumer. And that's where we get the win-wins that we were talking about earlier when we use data to help make these kinds of decisions.
Fantastic. So what do you think will be the future holds for HR analytics then? You know, what effect do you think HR technology will have in the coming years?
I think we're in a little bit of the hype cycle right now. If you're familiar with the hype cycle, it's sort of peaking right now.
Well, I know what you mean by that, if that's what you mean. I can certainly see the hype cycle all around me. Yeah, of course.
Right. And I think HR analytics is sort of in the middle of this hype cycle right now, in that executives and popular opinion and pop science are really saying, this is the thing, guys, we need to get on board. We need to invest in this. We need to build these tools. We need to gut our HR information systems. We need to do all these things to take care of the customer and to take care of the employee. And so from that perspective, I think it's going to cool off a little. So the hype cycle kind of says, right, something comes out and there's some success stories, right? So things go really up. And then everybody adopts it and they realize that it's not a magic bullet. And so it sort of falls off. And then it comes back and sort of levels off when we find out the true level that the innovation is really going to serve in the long term. So I think we're sort of near the peak. And eventually we're going to figure out, oh my gosh, HR analytics is not just going to fix every HR problem we've ever had ever. That said, it's a really important strategic partner with regard to how you take care of your employees. And so HR analytics functions will start to get more centralized. They may start to get picked up and moved over to the enterprise business intelligence types groups that do consumer behavior. And I think organizationally, you're going to see it sort of right now it's storming and forming, but it'll start norming over the next couple of years as teams get bigger and things settle down and people start to learn what we can really get from it. So I think that's the story from the organizational side. And also this is all gospel according to Chris, right? Like this is just my thoughts on it.
No, of course.
The other thing that I think is going to happen is our HR technology, that this hype cycle is going to serve to clean up the messy back room of HR data, right?
Yes.
We did this kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s in finance, where computers got really good and everybody's like, oh my gosh, there's all this cool finance data. Let's clean it up so that we can do forecasting and we can do predictive analytics and we can do, right? But behavioral economics. And so between like the late 90s and the 2010s, we're on this race to make our finance systems really good, and they kind of are. And I kind of see the HR systems kind of going through that as this hype cycle cools off. So as we level off, we'll sort of have this beautiful maturation of, okay, we know where HR analytics lives now. And now we have reasonably clean data across the industry. So now we can start to, I think, more systematically mature over the next, couple of decades as we start to figure out how to do this work.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that hype has also accelerated the innovation within HR tech?
Yes and no. I think yes, from the perspective that those of us that are prudent and able to not get too caught up in the hype have been able to put some really significant wins together. I think with innovation like this, people are often so focused on the competitive advantage, they forget some of the more important tenets. And that's when we hear these stories of, oh, you created a great selection algorithm. Too bad it doesn't select, people of color, and that's not really allowed, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of glaring examples where things have gone out, and that's not at Comcast. That's just general industry stuff I've seen. That sometimes we're so obsessed with winning that we don't do it the right way, and that creates a win that's not sustainable sometimes. At best. At worst, it creates something invalid that hurts the industry and hurts the credibility of HR analytics in general. So I think it's a tale of two things. One is those people that are prudent and saying, this is an amazing tool, we need to use it wisely. And others that are maybe putting the cart before the horse a little bit and are starting to realize that they need to get on a slightly more prudent track.
Yeah, very interesting. I think you're completely right, because I've noticed recently, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but every day now I come across a new HR analytics startup every day.
Yes,
and they're all claiming some magical things right. In what they can do for businesses, and even I'm contacted quite often by them through the podcast. They come across what we do, and every day there's thousands that I've come across in the last year or so who are claiming to be able to transform organizations for HR analytics. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because it must be quite difficult for organizations who are new in this space when there's so much going on. There's so many organizations out there that they're saying that they're presenting these fantastic solutions, level value. Where do you what type of questions do you ask to validate those organizations that they are going to be able to deliver what you need? And then there's 10 organizations that do the same thing. How do you get through that minefield? I know you've got the experience, of course, but the less experienced people, is any suggestions there? It's a bit of a random question, but even I'm looking at
it's borderline the most. I mean, it is an extremely insightful question, Chris, because it's something that HR, specifically the audience for this podcast, right, is often tasked with, right? Somebody comes with a new shiny object and says, we should spend $2 million on this shiny object because it's the shiniest of the shiny objects. And you have to figure out whether it's diamond or cubic, right? So two main points on that. The first is, the first question always is, where does this new thing live? Because, and when I say live, I mean, in what part of the data architecture are you solving for? Because I'll tell you, about 85 to 90% of what I see in this hype are what I'll call presentation layer software, right? So this is software that goes on top of your existing data and makes it really gooey, right? Meaning you can just point and click and drag and filter and cut and slice and visualize, and that's awesome. That type of software is only useful if your backend data is clean and reliable, right? So some of these companies do amazing things. They're best in class with this type of data. An example that comes to mind for me is Vizier. They do a really good job of visualizing data, allowing you to ask questions with your data, allowing somebody who's not technically savvy to cut and slice and explore their data. That said, it goes on top of whatever data the incumbent organization has. So if your data is not clean, you're not going to fix it by putting something on top of it. It's kind of like saying, I'm sorry your car doesn't have an engine, but we'll give you a fantastic paint job.
Yeah.
And HR executives don't live in the back end of data. They don't live with IT. They don't live with, HR information systems. They live at the report level. They ask, hey, I need a thing, and then a deck shows up in the next meeting, right? So I would encourage HR executives to get down to that next layer and get partnered with somebody who's technically savvy to evaluate, well, what is this solution offering us? Is it offering us a paint job, or is it offering us an ability to fix our engine? Because sometimes those paint jobs also come with mechanics. So you can say, I just want the paint job, or you can say, I want the paint job, but you also got to give me 3 mechanics, which you pay for, but it is a way to get your data clean. And then those mechanics are fixing your data in a way that it matches with the paint job. I hope that analogy kind of.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing for me, and this is especially with the rampant sexiness of machine learning, people are telling you they can predict.
That's what I was going to ask you. That was my next question. Predictive and prescriptive, they're 2 words that have been thrown out there, and they're also the ones that are popping up that I'm seeing around. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so 2 things on this. One is there's no real substitute for statistical prowess with regard to what type of math a given vendor is using to create these predictions. You need somebody who knows the difference between a logistic regression and exponential smoothing, a neural network, or random forest to be able to sit and have that conversation. You can't really get away from that skill set. That said, somebody with that skill set is probably sitting in your organization today. It just might not be in HR. Go to your consumer insights person. Go to your procurement people. Go to your finance people, right? There are quants sitting around in those places where you could say, hey, I want to explain this concept to you. And then I want you to tell me, they told me that it's a random forest. Is that going to work? And this does 2 things. One is it cross-pollinates a little, right? So you build a relationship with somebody who has kind of this stat background, which could be helpful. And it's teaching them a little bit about HR, but they may be able to advise you if you don't have that statistical competence in-house, right? The second thing is, and this is the one that worries me a little bit, is that sometimes these predictive things go to places that I'm not sure are ethical, even if they are legal. So for example, I've seen a piece of software, and I won't mention the name, that says, we can tell you when your executives are going to terminate by scraping their LinkedIn data to see what their activity is like.
I've seen that one too.
And to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, how could we possibly violate the trust and the privacy of our executives like that?
Yeah. Because
that's a piece of software that puts predictive validity above corporate responsibility. And I don't agree with that. And so then that's something anybody can ferret out. You don't need a stat, right? You don't need a stat background to be like, what do you mean you're using Facebook data to select
I know.
people?
And
That's
the borderline that I think a lot of people are wrestling with at the moment. And
Right.
You shouldn't be wrestling with it, to be honest. But a lot of these organizations I've seen, I know a specific organization that actually mentions looking at the LinkedIn profile, just updated their profile on LinkedIn to say X, currently looking for new opportunities and using that to predict when they're going to leave, etc. And I do think that's
right. So
yeah.
So to summarize your question, A is if you're trying to evaluate the statistical validity of a particular measure that they're using to give you some sort of insight, you need somebody who speaks that language to be able to really vet it. And what you don't need a statistical person do is to understand the ethical and legal compliance issues with particular types of science and where people are getting their data before they put them into whatever that measure is.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I think I should ask that question more often because it's something that's been on my mind recently. And so I'm glad that you also sort of jumped on it as well. Was like, that is a very important question to ask. So thank you very much for that. Well, look, that leads us quite nicely on to the quick fire round.
Okay.
Where I'm going to ask you 5 questions and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
I am ready.
What was the number one thing that was holding you back from becoming a senior leader within the field of HR analytics?
Oh, the one thing that was holding me back. I would say from being an HR executive, right? Balancing attention to detail with delivery speed and the impact that it has on project management, right? So as somebody who's in HR analytics, and for anybody out there who's in HR analytics, we tend to be cautious, thoughtful, and we want stuff to be perfect. Oftentimes you have to take that desire for ideal and marry it with the feasible delivery speed and impact that you have on a project management. I had a leader tell me once, 80% today is way better than 95% in 3 months. So balancing validity and, oh my gosh, we're not leading people off a cliff with it's got to get done reasonably quickly.
Very interesting. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Be princely. And I know that's really, really broad, but
you have to explain more about that.
So a prince has authority to make decisions, right? But when he's wise, he surrounds himself with experts in whatever the matter is at hand. He considers their opinions, but then he ultimately makes a decision that may or may not totally agree with the experts. And this is an important distinction, right? Because up until I got this piece of advice, I thought of it like either I do what I think is right or I do what others think is right. And if I choose the formers, it means I don't agree with them. But it's not really that black and white, right? A leader has to take input from many sources, which potentially have conflicting interests and conflicting agendas. And if you're too independent in that right, you become arrogant and you leave good insight on the table. If you're too codependent, you're simply just managing by consensus and you're removing your own agency and not bringing your own gifts to the table. So whenever I have to make that kind of decision, it's always a hard balance to strike. And I think I'll always struggle with it, but it's a really important piece of advice I got that I always try to keep in mind.
Great. What's one book that you'd recommend to our audience and why?
Oh, that one's easy. Simon Sinek's Start With Why.
So interesting that that's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, I mean, hands down, it's top 5 for me too in things that change the way I think about the world, right? Because his model of driving inspiration kind of flips that communication strategy on its head. So instead of starting with what you want people to do and then explaining them why you're better or why it's different, he shows that when you start with why you exist as a team or as a company, you can anchor basically any decision to, is it getting us closer or further away from that?
Exactly.
And as a data guy, I live in the what, right? But by connecting to a coherent why statement, I can take those whats and map them back to the ultimate vision that we're trying to get to. Because when you connect to your audience on that why level, even people that don't like data see that you guys are all rowing in the same direction. And it makes those numbers then become ingredients to success rather than just being some sort of box to check or some ball and chain that they're connected to.
Yeah. It also goes back to the point we mentioned very briefly earlier about storytelling.
Okay.
If you use that
totally
perfectly, right? If people presented with the why rather than just the data, you're going to get a lot more people engaged in the process as well. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. Can you share one internet resource that you use or a few internet resources you use to keep yourself up to date with current events and also to network and benchmark with your peers?
Sure. Can you give me the question one more time?
Yeah, in terms of your own growth and your own personal development, can you share any internet resources or online tools or
Okay.
websites that you use to keep up to date with current events in your field?
Yeah. So with current events in my field, I use the heck out of LinkedIn. And I also use the heck out of peer-based news sites. I really like peer-based news sites, things like Reddit, because they sort of provide I mean, they tend to be a little bit left-leaning, honestly, but by having a peer-to-peer network on a given topic, you can often get really niche information and niche data about something that's going on that you don't get from the more peanut butter news approach. So while I do stay up to date on the CNNs and the Fox Newses, and you've got to get the left and the right perspective, I really like peer-to-peer stuff because if I have a particular question about a particular aspect of a particular issue, there's a subreddit for that, right? You can sort of get in and figure out what's
down
going
as
on.
much as you want. Yeah. And if you can't find it, you can post about it and find
Right.
loads of other insights.
And you have to balance that, right? Because that's not the most credible resource in that it's not necessarily, some people cite their sources. But you have to take, my grandfather used to say, you have to ask 5 biased people because there aren't any other kind, right? So being able to go to multiple sources and triangulate your insights, I think is really important.
Fantastic. And what's something about your business? What's one thing about your business that most excites you today?
I'm really excited about the Internet of Things, which is sort of spanning telecommunications. And if you're not familiar with Internet of Things, it's essentially...
Don't worry, you don't need to explain that to me.
Okay.
My entire house is
it's the Internet of Things.
You have no idea. From vacuum
Right.
cleaners to light switches to every single plug being Wi-Fi to walking in the living room, turning on my TV with my voice to my lights turning white when I get a Gmail email.
That is awesome.
Turning blue when I get a Facebook message.
Yeah. So Internet of Things, honestly, like
so much room for HR to use that.
Yeah. Honestly, it improves the consumer experience. So I'm excited about it from that perspective. It also has phenomenal implications for industrial applications, right? Agriculture and the sorts of sensors we can put in places to learn about, when a head end for cable is going to break before it breaks, right? Or when the soil's too dry and we need to irrigate it. It also has implications for taking care of employees, right? There's already companies out there that say, hey, we'll give you a free Fitbit. And if you walk 10,000 steps a day for the next 6 months, we'll give you $500 off of your insurance premium, right? So we say, hey, if you want to actively get healthy and you can show us that you're doing it, we'll give back to you. That's a place where the Internet of Things is starting to really unlock the power of an individual being able to customize their employee experience more than they ever have. Right now it's, do you smoke, do you not smoke? If you smoke, you have to pay a surcharge. If you don't, you don't. But hey, if we can unlock this Internet of Things at the employee level, holy crow, what we could do to help improve people's ability to customize their own employee experiences.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I'm really excited about it as well. Even recently, I was speaking to a HR director of an insurance company, and they're talking about how they're now using it in the cars, that if you drive a certain limit, they can measure that in the car, and now your insurance premium goes down because you're a safe driver now, and they can measure that. Whereas if you're someone that keeps going over the speed limit and they can see that, then your insurance is going to go up.
Right. If you take those, it really adds statistical power to those actuarial tables, right?
Yeah.
And allows you to get far more richness out of your day-to-day behaviors that can, for the motivated person, really provide customization in a positive way.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have to leave that for a whole new episode to talk about that. But look, you've been an amazing guest, Chris. So thank you very much for sharing your insight. It's certainly going to be of value to our members. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Of course. It was a pleasure to be here.
No problem. Give our listeners one parting piece of guidance and also the best way to get in contact with you if they'd like to do so.
Okay. Parting advice. Okay. So Thomas Jefferson has this famous quote that a lot of succeeding in business is luck, but the harder he works, the more luck he seems to have. And so I guess my parting piece of guidance is to always be working to differentiate yourself. If you're a student, right, pick the harder assignment, do the extra work, volunteer at that extra place. If you're early in your career, prepare more thoroughly, volunteer for the stretch assignments, don't miss opportunities to build your brand. And if you're a leader, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo or be afraid to do what you know is right, even if it's not the popular choice, because I definitely believe that history books are filled with the people who differentiated themselves, right? Whether it's Mozart or Da Vinci or Gandhi, right? These are folks who strove to be different, and not just different for difference sake, right? But difference towards that why, right? To go back to the book. And so the harder you work, the more breaks you'll get your way. So when you differentiate yourself, that is a good place to anchor your actions to.
Fantastic. And the best way to get in contact with you?
LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn.
I'm just going to start putting it in there from now on, just saying LinkedIn, because I think everyone's.
Yeah, I'm not huge on Twitter or Facebook much, but I'm very active on LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. So if you find it, look up my last name. There aren't a whole ton of us out there. You should be able to find me pretty quickly. Always happy to chat, mentor, advice. I talk to grad students on a regular basis about things, so definitely open to getting connected with folks.
Great. Well, look, you've been an amazing guest. Guys, make sure you head over to hrdleaders.com. There you'll find all of the show notes on the episode, links to everything we've mentioned, all of the resources that were discussed. Chris, thank you again for sharing your journey, and have a good Christmas.
Sure, thanks,
I look forward to working with you and speaking with you next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one, Chris.